Hello, and welcome to another video from the Word of God Ministries, covering some concepts in whole Bible Christianity. I'm Bruce Bertram, and in this video we're going to be doing something a little different. You notice the background has changed if you've been following our videos, and I'm trying to make it a little less formal, a little more easy to set up, and we'll see if this works. It's allergy season here for me, and so I ask you to pardon me for a little bit of sniffling, and maybe a sneeze here and there. It's been a long time since I made a video, probably close to a year now, and apologize for the delay. We've been working on some other things. For instance, we built some greenhouses recently. Got one of them completed last fall, and we are doing something called aquaponics, and so that's taking a lot of time, and I'm doing a lot of work, and by the time Sabbath rolls around, which is usually when I make these videos, I'm really tired and I really need Sabbath. So again, I apologize for the delay for those of you who really look forward to these videos. Also, we're trying to get our book published, at least on Kindle. Finally got the ISBN numbers we needed, and saved up enough money for it. So we're going to be doing that pretty soon too. Well, in this series of videos, I want to look at the Revelation chapter 1, 2, and 3. When I first started doing these, doing the study on these, I thought maybe we'd have a couple of short videos, and I was wrong, because the more I got into it, the more I realized that it is pretty involved. There's a lot of questions that I came up with as I started studying. For instance, why the letters to those 7 congregations? There's lots of congregations in existence at the time, we hope, you would think, congregations that were even close by, like for instance Laodicea and Colossae or Colossae, however you pronounce that, are almost right next door to each other. The towns are, but there is no letter to the Colossians except for the one Paul wrote. So that was one of my first questions. Why these 7 congregations? Another question that kind of popped up is which congregations, not only why these 7 out of all of the congregations, but also why these particular 7? Were they, and these questions have been asked before by other people, were they were obviously 7 congregations that were in existence at the time, but do they also, are they also pointed at 7 types of congregations, or 7 types of groups of believers, or 7 types of believers even? Some people have thought that maybe it was 7 different church ages. First, Ephesus or Ephesians being the first century or so, and so on. And are they 7 congregations that exist today? Not only geographically in Western Turkey, which is where these 7 congregations were at, but are they typical of 7 types of congregations in modern times? So that was some other questions I had. An observation I made at one point is that there is no church in the Bible. And I know that seems rather startling, but there is none. We'll do more on that. We'll probably do a separate video on that subject all by itself. But it's critical to understand also some of the things that were going on at the time that this book was written, and these 7 letters in particular. Like I said, the geographic location of these congregations are in Western Turkey, which in modern times is experiencing quite a bit of upheaval and persecution of believers. Many believers dying at the hands of Muslim, well, you can call them extremists, but I don't know that there's really a difference in Muslims. I'm sure there's a few non-murderous Muslims, but it seems like the bulk of them, it's more of a political belief system than anything that connected with God, especially the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Obviously, we can tell by the behavior, but our brethren in those areas are getting persecuted, chased around, killed, churches burned or buildings burned, just horrible things going on. So, do these letters have any application to today? So that's another thing that we're going to be looking at. So I've developed some slides so that we can so that you can see a graphic representation of what I'm trying to talk about. This video will cover what scholars call the parting of the ways. And if you see me looking down and looking this way, it's because I have a computer with 3 monitors, and I'm looking at my Bible, I'm looking at my notes, and I'm looking at the slides that you'll be seeing on the video. So anyway, the book was written probably somewhere towards the end of AD 100. Right about, apparently a church father by the name of Irenaeus says John received the revelation near the end of the reign of Domitian, which would have been AD 96. So most people think it was written in the mid-90s. Some people think it was written earlier, like around the 60s or so. It would seem that because he doesn't really mention the destruction of the temple, that could be correct, but I think that I think it was probably written around the mid-90s for a lot of reasons. But some of the books you can read in the Bible to help with this study is you can read some of John's other writings, 1, 2, and 3 John, for instance, the Gospel of John. You can also read, as I mentioned before, the letter to the Colossians, written by Paul to the Colossians, probably somewhere by the mid-50s or early 60s, so 30 or 40 or 50 years before this revelation was given to John. And to get an idea, you read the book of Colossians, you might be able to get a little bit of background, a little bit of an idea of what might have been going on in that area, Laodicea and Colossae, by reading Paul's letter to the Colossians. There was apparently a letter to Laodicea also written at the same time as Colossians, and the cities of Colossae and Laodicea were supposed to exchange letters. Once they read their own, they were supposed to swap and read the other cities. So that gives us a little bit of an idea of the writing and some of the background, biblical background, that you might be able to read to help you understand a little bit more about what might have been going on here. So what had been happening, and what we're going to see here in some slides, that's why this video is called The Parting of the Ways, because what happened over time is let's go right to the slides here, and we'll start illustrating it to you. It was called the parting of the ways because gradually what became known as the church was drifting away or trying to separate itself from Judaism, trying to define themselves, and it took a while. You can look at, there's some other videos you can look at for some background too that we've made. You can look at, say for instance, a whole body, a new thing, and we'll put the URL is on the bottom of the screen. The link here is on the screen. And another one is our book that we'll get out pretty soon, hopefully, and you can get on Kindle. It's called Whole Bible Christianity, and it has a scripture index of over about 1,400 entries from direct quotations and references from the Bible. Anyway, let's take a look at the first slide where we see that Jesus is resurrected somewhere around AD 33, give or take. We don't know exactly when he was born. Some people think they've figured it out, but anyway, so Jesus is resurrected. That's the slide, the first slide. Next, the New Testament. You can see on the slide. Most of the New Testament was written by around AD 60, give or take a few years, except for the book of Revelation. Then you can see from the next slide that the book of Acts was covering the period of time roughly from the resurrection of the Christ to around the 60s. So somewhere, it covers a period probably somewhere around 30 years or so, give or take. And we think you can look at the book of Acts in relation to this parting of the ways as a hardening of hearts. Okay, there were new believers coming in, but there was also a hardening of hearts in Judaism and a lot of Gentiles, where the believers and the unbelievers, if you will, are getting polarized, and the unbelievers are getting harder and harder, and they're getting more and more inclined to persecute the believers, and that really is what the book of Acts shows a lot of, is a lot of persecution for the new believers. Then the next slide, slide number 5, slide number 4, in AD 70 the temple was destroyed. Romans came in and just flattened it. The reason why is because there were a series of rebellions by people in Israel, mostly hardline Jews. The Zealots were leaders in that. Probably some of the scribes and Pharisees who chafed at Roman rule and wanted to see Israel returned to being its own nation. So the Romans came in to put down a rebellion and destroyed the temple in 70 AD. Then the next one, next interesting incident is something called the Fiscus Judaicus tax. It was instituted in right around the time of the destruction of the temple, and there was it was supposed to punish the Jews for rebellion. It was a tax on the Jews that was going to be collected and sent to the pagan temple of Jupiter in Rome. And so the temple tax that the Jews used to pay for the maintenance of their own temple, since the temple was destroyed, as a penalty, the Roman emperors wanted to collect a tax and support a pagan temple. So this was a problem in trying to figure out who was a Jew. And some think this tax lasted all the way until 362 or so AD. The next slide tells us, or shows graphically, that Domitian, somewhere in the middle 80s, extended the tax to those who lived like Jews. So not only were there continued rebellions after the destruction of the temple, but there was this tax, and there was a lot of hard feelings from the Roman side against the Jews, and so the tax is instituted, and that caused a lot of hard feelings. Then Domitian extends the tax to those who live like Jews. In other words, they're trying to figure out, how do we figure out who's a Jew? And, well, probably the way they dress, the way they eat, the holidays that they practice, all the external things that mark Judaism. So if the believers, and I believe they were all still doing the things of the Bible, like Bible holidays and diet and dress and so on, then they would tend to get scooped up or included in the reaction, the Roman reaction to the Jewish rebellions. They would also tend to, they would get hit with these taxes. So Domitian, the Emperor Domitian, was a brother of Titus, who destroyed the temple, and another son of Vespasian. He thought that Romans who converted to, in his opinion, the atheism of Judaism, he kind of included believers as well as Jews. So the Romans didn't see any difference. So it contributed to as we'll see, it contributed to the believers trying to differentiate themselves from the Jews. And it probably sounds familiar to you. Next slide is about AD 95. John writes the Revelation, or he receives the Revelation and he writes it down, and he sends it at least to 7 congregations. So again, there's in the next slide you see in around 100 AD, there's some more obvious evidence of people trying to separate themselves from Judaism, believers trying to separate themselves from Judaism. Then in 135, in the next slide, 135 AD, the Jerusalem is destroyed. Again, the result of rebellion. And the Roman armies came in and smashed Jerusalem flat, sowed it, plowed it, and sowed it with salt. So nothing would grow there. And they just completely flattened Jerusalem. Now, around these times, around the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the entire city of Jerusalem, there was disagreement between Jews and believers, where believers were trying to say things like, we need to, when we see the Jerusalem surrounded by enemies, that's what Jesus said, we need to get out. And the Jews were like, a lot of the Jews were like, no, we need to stay and fight. And if you read back through the scriptures, especially in some of the books written around through the time of when the kingdom had split, the kingdom of Israel had split, and there was idolatry, and there were enemies coming in and beating up on them, and a lot of the same things happened between Jews who listened to the prophets, and for instance, there was a time when they were supposed to give in to Babylon and they would be able to live, and some of them did and some of them didn't. So you see the same behavior pattern as you do around the time of 135 AD, where there are believers trying to say, let's do what God says, and there are Jews trying to say, no, we think we know better. So again, you're driving the two groups are being driven or driving themselves further and further apart. So in the next slide, you see the graphic that shows that the New Testament was assembled and accepted as a series of books for the Bible, or on equal footing with the Old Testament, sometime about AD 200. So for roughly 170 years after the resurrection, there were books written all the way up through the 60s, and then John's book for the Revelation in 95 or 96, and then these books are floating around. People are copying them, handing them around to each other, but they haven't been all collected together and called the New Testament yet. And there were some other books that were rejected to be part of the New Testament canon. So you see, around 200 you get the New Testament. The next slide, I have made a graphic showing that between or maybe around 135, maybe as early as 100 or even earlier, the church, what we know as, or what has become the church, is born and grows and is gradually taken over by Nicolaitans. Now, you can see in our video, or you can study in our video about the Nicolaitans in our video, A Whole Body, the Nicolaitans, and you can click on the screen to find it or view it. So what we mean by Nicolaitans is essentially a group of people who thought they were in charge, and rather than say, for instance, a shepherd or an elder who helped a local congregation out with studying the Word and maybe helping people in their daily living, you gradually see what comes out. We sometimes call them the church fathers, and I don't mean to say that all church fathers were Nicolaitans, but there were a lot of them who were trying to get control, and they were trying to make authoritative rulings. And there was in one way this kind of needed to be done, because there was a lot of bad stuff, a lot of bad doctrine going around, bad teachings. So they were trying to get a handle on that, and so you have to give them credit for that. But what gradually happened is, as we'll see in the next slide, in about 311, Jesus believers are maybe finally recognized as separate from Jews in 311. Then, in the next slide, the church, and this is where I call it the end result of what all this happening, all this driving apart and these rebellions and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, is in 325 AD, an emperor by the name of Constantine has a vision, and apparently something along the nature of seeing a cross or a flaming cross or whatever, and hearing a voice saying, "In this sign conquer." So he embraced Christianity, or what we think of as Christianity. Actually, he was in the process of sort of helping to form Christianity at the time. So he embraced the idea of belief in Jesus, and made it the state religion. the empire religion. This is where we start calling them the Holy Roman Empire. That's in 325 AD. There's a council at a place called Nicaea, and we'll find out in a little bit where that is at too. And I think it has a bearing on why these, the book of Revelation and the 7 letters to the congregations, one of the reasons why those 7 were chosen is because in 325 AD a big shift takes place, and instead of Jesus believers being persecuted along with Jews, now just the Jews are persecuted, and the Jesus believers are now part of the state, the Roman Empire, which is not a good thing. So you finally have this whole parting of the ways thing kind of come to a head, and now, and what I call is the church is born. And this is why I say, one of the reasons why I say there's no church in the Bible. Because if you study it and realize that the word church wasn't invented till around probably, nobody really knows, but maybe around the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. The word used in the scriptures is ecclesia. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. I just want to wrap up talking about the parting of the ways here, because what was happening is this parting of the ways, and it, in my opinion, it was also a parting of the ways from the Bible. In other words, the church became a sort of a separate entity, like Judaism. Like it had leaders, like Judaism had rabbis, the church had bishops, and eventually popes. And part of the Nicolaitan structure. Nicolaitan, again, meaning, if you haven't watched the other video, Nicolaitan seems to mean ruling over lay people. And so I think it points to a group of people, and there's always a group of people that wants power. And this group of people wants to organize, and they want to call the shots, and they want to define things, and that's what happened. All the way up until Christianity the Christians get recognized by the Roman Empire in 325 and actually embraced as the state religion. During that time, as far as as Constantine was taking over Christianity, he led the way in a lot of changes to practices, such as the Sabbath was now Sunday, not Saturday. And a lot of people violently object to this because, of course, it paints us, the church, the modern church, as doing something wrong. And we, the church in general, don't want to admit that. So one of the reasons why, one of the hardest things to do when you're reading the scriptures and God's talking about a particular group of people, like say for instance the Nicolaitans, is it's very hard to identify who they are. One of the main reasons it is hard to identify who they are is because it's us. If it's you that the Bible is talking about negatively, the tendency is to not want to admit it. And so then we're looking at it. We eliminate ourselves as the culprits, and so then we're looking around or the Nicolaitans are looking around saying, well, I don't understand who the Nicolaitans are. And it's because they need a mirror. And just hold up the mirror and you will see the Nicolaitans. They are the people who want to rule over lay people. They want to grab control, power. They want to call the shots. And then what starts happening is things like what happened with Constantine and Christianity. Constantine takes over. He calls a group of people together, and he has a series of conferences. And he was trying to define Christianity as separate from Judaism still. So that's one of the reasons why this is called the parting of the ways. You can see it in the book of Acts in a very clear manner. And as time goes on, it gets worse and worse. So, so we get into some of the other things that Constantine did was he called Sunday the Sabbath. He combined some pagan feasts with some church stories or Bible stories. One of these feasts or holidays was called Christ Mass or Christmas. And gradually more and more of that happened because he was trying to make Christianity more palatable to the pagans of the Roman Empire, and he was trying to combine it. And something that God commanded not to be done, mixing. And that's why one of the things God commanded in his Torah. They would do things like, apparently they would chisel off pagan deity names from statues, and they would chisel on saints' names. So there started to be a worship of saints, a worship of Mary, and there were reasons for this. If you look at the pagan roots, you'll see that this is a common practice from a long time back. I mean, the paganism overlap with Christianity or with belief in God. Even back with Judaism in the days when Israel was falling apart and getting hammered by enemies, one of the reasons is because they were mixing. They were doing pagan practices. So the persecution by the state in 325 AD is gone. The price for that was a takeover of the church by the Nicolaitans. Okay, so as time went on, the church drifts further and further from the plain meaning of God's word. And there was a further drift away, trying to define themselves separate from Judaism. It's one of the reasons why they didn't want to do the quote-unquote Jewish holidays, even though Leviticus 23:2 clearly says they're God's holy days. Changing of dietary items. They started developing doctrines that told us that we didn't have to follow God's laws, Torah, word that means instruction if you don't know. They just kept going and going and going, and to the modern day. And another reason why I say there is no church in the Bible is because you will not find the Presbyterians, the Catholics, the Baptists, the Protestants. You will not find Lutherans. You will not find Methodists, Mormons, JWs, Jehovah's Witnesses. You will not find any of them in the Word. All of them, every single group, grabs a word like church and defines themselves as something that is genuine. They think they're genuine, and however, if you really get to looking, they're not there in the Bible. The believers, obviously the early believers, followed Torah. It's one of the reasons why they got caught up in the taxes and the rebellions and so on, is because they looked and acted like a lot like Jews. And this over time was a problem for people, and so they separated. So so I guess for right now, we'll end this video, and because it's already been almost 30 some minutes. In the next video, I think we're going to take a look at some more about why I say there's no church in the Bible, the word ecclesia, how it's used, and So we'll save that for the next video. And then we'll look at some of the geographic particulars as far as where these congregations were and why I think this is so important. This background information is so important. Actually, you should be starting to see why some of this information is so important. So thank you for watching. We got a website, www.wholebible.com, with some other types of articles, and actually there's a copy of our book, Whole Bible Christianity, which is in PDF form, and you can look through the chapters. Again, thanks for watching, and thanks for your patience and waiting for us to start putting out videos again. May the peace of God be with you in your studies, and plunge in, read the Word, and do the Word, and don't just rely on what I'm saying or our series of videos or articles. It's all right there in the Word. Read it and do it. Shalom.